It was one of those bitter nights in February of 1988 that still bites at the back of my memory. The kind of cold that seems to seep through your uniform, into your bones, until even the sound of the wind feels sharp. Black and I had drawn the short straw that evening, working a standard patrol loop around Fort Campbell. And for most of it, the only thing keeping us company was static on the radio and the rhythmic hum of the truck's engine. Nothing unusual, nothing worth remembering until the call came through. Our dispatch broke in, relaying a message from the Clarksville Police Department. They had received a 911 report from a civilian claiming to have seen a small aircraft flying dangerously low over the base's southern fence line. The caller insisted the plane went down somewhere within the perimeter. Because the crash site would technically be inside federal property, the civilian police couldn't investigate it. That left us, the night shift MPs, to handle it first. Black and I happened to be near that part of the base anyway, so we were tasked with checking it out. I remember exchanging a look with him, half skeptical, half curious. Plane crashes didn't exactly happen on routine patrols. We didn't expect to find anything more than an overactive imagination and a false alarm. The southern stretch of Campbell was open country, long, broken fields with scattered tree lines and brush pockets instead of dense forest. Driving slow, we swept the spotlight back and forth along the ground, letting the beam slide through the gaps between the trees. The light cut through mist and cold air in pale ribbons. I was about to tell Black that whoever called probably mistook a flare or meteor for an aircraft when we both saw it. Twisted metal glinting in the dark about 75 yards off the road. I stopped the truck. The shape in the field didn't look right. No fire, but steam drifted in low waves from the wreckage, catching the light like breath. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped out into the night. The ground underfoot was soft and uneven, scattered with fragments that shimmered as our beams crossed them. Every crunch of debris sounded too loud. I hesitated for a second, thinking I should radio it in before we left the truck, but the instinct to see it up close, to confirm it, was stronger. We moved in, careful not to step on anything vital, though it was nearly impossible. The closer we got, the clearer it became that this wasn't some civilian plane. The tail section, the stubbed wings, the gun pods, it hit us at once. This was one of ours, a U.S. Army Apache, or what was left of one. My stomach dropped as I scanned for any flicker of flame or scent of fuel. None. The air was cold and metallic, the kind of cold that makes even the quiet feel sterile. We approached the fuselage slowly, hoping, stupidly, that someone might still be alive in there. But the crash had been brutal. The impact crater stretched deep into the dirt, surrounded by a fan of smaller craters. Pieces of the chopper embedded in them, like shrapnel from a bomb. Detached rockets were scattered among the debris. The field bore the marks of a violent end. A helicopter that had slammed, bounced, rolled, and finally given up against the frozen ground. Our flashlights followed the invisible trail back toward the tree line, and that's when we saw where the top branches had been sheared clean off. The call about the low-flying craft suddenly made sense. It must have clipped those trees before tumbling in. Judging by the damage, the pilot had almost no time to react. The cockpit area was mangled beyond reason, canopy shattered, instruments torn apart. I told Black to check for any signs of survivors in the cockpit while I went back to the truck to report the crash. He nodded, already moving toward the wreck. I jogged back, crunching over twisted fragments of rotor blades, thinking through what I'd say to dispatch. Confirmed downed aircraft, likely military, no fire, approaching for survivors. But before I could even lift the handset, the night turned strange. Bravo 47 to command, do you copy? I said. The reply came clean at first. Command here, go ahead Bravo. I started to report. We're at, then the line fractured. A sharp, electric hum flooded the channel, a tone so unnatural it made my teeth ache. Command, do you read? I tried again. Nothing but that hum. I switched frequencies. Same interference. Different channels, same thing. It wasn't static, it was a deliberate piercing signal, like a wire shorting out endlessly. I knew radios well enough to tell this wasn't random atmospheric noise. Someone or something was jamming our comms. There were no power lines out here, no generators, nothing that could cause interference of that magnitude. I sat there for a few seconds, just listening to it hiss and vibrate through the speaker, feeling the air in the cab buzz faintly. Finally, I slammed the handset down, grabbed the fire extinguisher from the cargo area, and headed back toward the wreckage, still half listening for any voice to cut through the noise. When I reached the Apache again, Black was standing by what remained of the cockpit, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. "You're not gonna believe this," he said, his voice low. I stepped beside him, peering through the cracked canopy, and froze. The man strapped into the pilot's seat was wearing the wrong uniform. Not the olive flight suit we all knew. This was older. Vietnam-era fatigues, OD green, buttoned front, heavy fabric. And on his upper sleeve, faint but unmistakable in the flashlight's glare, was a patch, a foreign flag, Honduras. I'd spent a short stint in Central America years earlier, enough to recognize it immediately. My first thought was disbelief. What the hell was a Honduran soldier doing flying an American attack helicopter inside US airspace? The man's helmet, though, was ours. Standard issue with the night vision and targeting systems built in. He was dead, of course. There was no doubt. The nose section was crushed in on itself. The seat behind him where the gunner would have sat had been completely obliterated. I glanced at Black, who looked just as lost as I felt. The radio interference still screamed faintly from the truck behind us, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground. I told him about it, how every frequency was jammed, and he just stared at me for a moment, like he couldn't decide which was stranger, the dead foreign pilot or the fact that our own comms were being blocked inside a secure US base. We circled the wreck carefully, debating what to do next. The protocol said to secure the area, report immediately, but with no radio, that wasn't happening. The best we could manage was to keep the site safe until higher command arrived. Maybe prevent a fire if one sparked up. The silence pressed in heavier than before, broken only by the faint hiss from the field and the occasional creak of cooling metal. Then, far off, the low rumble of approaching engines. Headlights appeared over the rise, cutting through the dark. At first, I thought it was backup. Then I saw the vehicles, 2 Humvees, followed by a deuce-and-a-half transport truck. They rolled in fast, engines growling, and skidded to a halt at the edge of the clearing. Soldiers poured out, at least a dozen of them. But something was off. Their uniforms were black. No unit patches, no names, nothing but subdued American flags on their sleeves. Their rifles were up, M16, locked and loaded, and they swept the area like they were securing a hostile zone, not a crash site. My first instinct was to raise my hands to make it clear we were MPs, but they already knew who we were. One of them, wearing sergeant stripes, glanced at me through the glare of a headlamp but said nothing. Then a colonel, a lieutenant colonel, and 2 majors stepped out of the Humvees. No identifiers on them either, just rank on the collars. The colonel stopped, pointed straight at us and shouted, "You will leave." Now, Black stood his ground when the colonel barked that order, his breath fogging the cold air. His voice clipped and calm as he answered, "Sir, with respect, we can't abandon the scene until we're officially relieved." The words came out like they always did when he went full regulation. Every syllable precise, every rulebook clause implied between them. But I could already see where this was heading. The colonel's eyes were flat and cold, the kind of look that doesn't see people, just problems to remove. His jaw tightened, and the silence that followed pressed on my chest like a physical weight. I wanted to grab Black by the shoulder, tell him to just back down and get in the truck, but something in the air froze me where I stood. The men in black had spread out in a wide semicircle around the wreckage, rifles steady, the faint whir of engines behind them making the night hum. The only light came from their vehicles and our flashlights, and under it their faces looked carved out of stone. No names, no insignia, no emotion. Just black fabric, black gear, and the faint glint of wet metal. The colonel turned slowly toward the sergeant, the one who had his rifle already half raised, and said in a tone so measured it chilled me, "If they're not gone in 30 seconds, kill them." Then without missing a beat, he added, "Dispose of their bodies with the wreck." His hand motioned lazily toward the helicopter, like he was talking about trash to be burned. It was one of those moments where time seems to slow down and every sound sharpens. The hiss of cooling metal, the low hum of the trucks, even my own heartbeat in my ears. I looked at the sergeant, who was already stepping forward, rifle up, his finger resting on the trigger guard. I didn't even think. I turned on my heel, walked back toward our truck, and climbed inside without saying a word. My hands felt steady, though my chest was shaking. I started the engine, the headlights flaring against the dark road ahead. My foot hovered over the brake. I didn't dare look in the mirror. Every second that passed felt like the edge of a cliff. I wanted to shout at Black, to drag him if I had to, But before I could even open my mouth, the passenger door swung open and he slid in, silent, his face white with disbelief. The moment his boots hit the floorboard, I shifted into drive and floored it. Gravel sprayed out from under the tires as we shot forward, the truck fishtailing slightly before catching traction and roaring down the dirt road. I didn't breathe until the glow of headlights behind us had vanished. For a long time, neither of us said a word. The night swallowed the sound of our engine, leaving only that eerie hum still faintly ringing in my ears, the same one that had flooded the radio earlier. I realized I was gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. Finally, Black exhaled, a shaky breath that sounded more like disbelief than relief. "You think he meant it?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The look in that colonel's eyes had said enough. The kind of man who gives that order isn't bluffing. We kept driving, following the perimeter road back toward the main compound, the fog thickening as we went. The base felt wrong, silent, empty, like even the night creatures were holding their breath. Every so often I glanced at the radio, half expecting that strange hum to flare up again, but it stayed dead, cold and quiet. It wasn't until we were nearly halfway back to the main gate that it came back to life, crackling suddenly, startling me so badly I almost swerved. "Bravo 47, this is command. Do you copy?" The voice was sharp, normal, like nothing had ever happened. I picked up the handset, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Command, this is Bravo 47. We're fine." Static hissed briefly. Then the voice asked, "What were you trying to report earlier?" "We lost you for a bit." My eyes met Black's. I hesitated. "Nothing found," I said finally, keeping my tone flat. "Still searching the area?" There was a pause, then Command responded, "Copy that, Bravo. Continue your patrol and report back at shift's end." The radio went quiet again. The drive back felt longer than it should have. The roads seemed darker, the familiar turns unfamiliar. When we finally reached the motor pool, I parked the truck in its usual spot, shut off the engine, and just sat there for a while. Black didn't move either. Neither of us wanted to be the first to step out, to break the uneasy silence. Eventually, we made our way to the station. The fluorescent lights inside felt too bright, too clean. Our shift commander was waiting, standing behind his desk with that expression officers get when they already know the answer to the question they're about to ask. "Did you find anything out there?" he said quietly. His tone wasn't casual, it was careful, measured. I cleared my throat, glanced at Black, then back at him. "No, sir. Nothing to report." For a second, I thought Black might contradict me. His lips parted, his eyes flicked toward the door, but then he nodded. "Nothing unusual," he echoed. The commander studied us for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then finally he nodded, relief washing across his face so quickly I almost missed it. "All right, you're dismissed." That was it. No questions, no paperwork, just that. I walked out of the office in a daze. Outside, the night felt colder than before. My hands were trembling now, not from the chill, but from the delayed realization of how close we'd come to dying in that field. I drove home without stopping anywhere, the base lights flashing past like a slow metronome. When I finally reached my apartment, I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat on the couch, staring at nothing, the echo of the colonel's voice looping in my mind. "If they're not gone in 30 seconds, kill them." I must have sat there for an hour before I finally dragged myself to bed. The room felt too quiet. I kept expecting to hear that strange hum again, or the sound of engines outside my window. None came, just silence. That kind that stretches so deep it feels like it's waiting for something. We never heard another word about any civilian crash. No reports, no investigations, no mentions. It was as if the entire thing had been erased. For years after, I found myself wondering, was that colonel bluffing? Or would he really have done it? If we'd refused to leave, would those black uniformed soldiers have opened fire and buried us alongside that wreck? I'll never know. And as time passed, another question grew louder. What happened to the bodies of the men in that helicopter, the Honduran pilot and whoever had been with him? Were they given proper burials? Were their families told? Or were they quietly absorbed into some classified folder, their names struck from existence along with the wreckage we found that night? Years later, when memory had dulled some of the fear, but not the strangeness of that night, I began piecing together details that the Army never bothered to explain. It started with a news report I caught by accident, a short segment about a sudden troop deployment to Honduras, March of 1988. The words Operation Golden Pheasant flickered on the screen, and something in my chest tightened. A month after that night at Fort Campbell, the same month the Honduran pilot's uniform would have made sense. I didn't move from the couch, didn't even blink, as the broadcast played footage of soldiers loading onto C-130, parachutes packed tight, faces blank under the weight of secrecy. The reporter called it a joint readiness exercise between the US and Honduran militaries, but the phrasing sounded like camouflage, just another label meant to keep civilians comfortable. I remembered that patch on the pilot's sleeve, the foreign flag illuminated in my flashlight's beam, and realized he must have been part of the covert training program that no one was supposed to know existed. It wasn't a civilian plane crash at all. It was a military experiment gone wrong, erased before sunrise. Looking back, I should have known. A year before that deployment, in late 1986, I had already been down there myself. Honduras, thick with humidity and mosquitoes, red clay underfoot, and the constant whine of generators in the jungle. Officially, we were assisting with airfield construction, laying groundwork for joint operations. Unofficially, we were setting up staging areas for something much larger. The command never used words like offensive or preparation. They said cooperation, defense, readiness. But everyone knew what it meant. The Cold War hadn't thawed yet, not really. Washington was still obsessed with drawing invisible lines against communism. Lines that always seemed to cut through places far from home. We'd already lost too many friends in Vietnam trying to hold one of those lines. Now they were drawing new ones in Central America. During my deployment, I'd heard whispers among the engineers and contractors, Honduran officers being trained by American pilots, learning to fly Apaches and Cobras in secret. It sounded like rumor at the time, something traded between smoke breaks and poker games. But that night in 1988, when I saw the dead pilot in U.S. hardware wearing another nation's flag, all those whispers came roaring back. It made an ugly kind of sense. The U.S. was arming and training anti-communist allies, just like before. But this time the proxy line ran through Honduras into Nicaragua. The Sandinistas had taken control of Nicaragua in 1979 after overthrowing the US-backed government. Now the Contras, a patchwork of rebels supported by American intelligence, were fighting to take it back. Officially, Congress had banned US military involvement after the chaos of Vietnam. Unofficially, the policy never stopped. They just changed the vocabulary. Advisors, observers, exercises, those words covered everything. Operation Golden Pheasant was labeled as an emergency readiness deployment. Thousands of troops from the 82nd Airborne were sent to Honduras for training. The official line was that it was meant to deter Sandinista incursions across the border. What it really looked like, at least to anyone paying attention, was preparation for a war that hadn't been declared. The Pentagon said the soldiers wouldn't go near the border. The locals said otherwise. And just like every operation with too many secrets, the story twisted itself into politics. When the public discovered that U.S. funds were secretly supporting the Contras by funneling money through Iran, an arrangement so insane it felt like fiction, it blew up into the Iran-Contra scandal. Hearing about it years later, I thought about that wrecked Apache and the black uniformed men who threatened to kill us if we didn't leave. It all lined up in a way that made my stomach knot. The part that still haunts me isn't just the secrecy, it's the precision. Those men didn't stumble onto that crash site by chance. They were already mobilized, already en route. Someone knew exactly when that helicopter went down and sent them before any normal base response could arrive. That meant one thing. Fort Campbell Command wasn't the top of the chain that night. Someone else was pulling strings, using our own patrol network to mask their cleanup operation. The colonel, the majors, the nameless sergeant, they weren't there to investigate. They were there to erase. The Apache, the Honduran pilot, any trace of the mission. Us too, if we had stayed 30 seconds longer. I tried more than once to find any official record of that crash. Aviation reports, maintenance logs, flight rosters, nothing. The system listed no missing aircraft, No pilot casualties, no training mishaps. The only helicopter crash near Fort Campbell that February was marked as routine maintenance test. No fatalities. A lie neatly folded into paperwork. Even years later, veterans' records show no acknowledgement of foreign trainees operating Apaches before 1990. But I saw him. I can still see his face in the flicker of my flashlight, the glassy stare, the blood frozen at the corner of his mouth, the patch on his sleeve. That's not something a man forgets. When I left the service, I told myself I'd stop looking backward. But memory doesn't obey orders. It drifts, uninvited, especially on cold nights when the wind sounds like static. Sometimes I'll be driving home, radio on low, and for a split second that same hum will rise through the speakers. The same electronic whine that jammed our comms that night. I'll glance at the dashboard expecting the signal to vanish, but it lingers just long enough to turn my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Then silence again. I used to tell myself it was coincidence, feedback from nearby towers. Now I'm not so sure. Even now, decades later, I can't help wondering if anyone else from the base that night remembers it. If any of the other patrol units noticed the blackout, the static, the unmarked vehicles tearing through the southern sector. Maybe they were told to forget, or maybe they didn't live long enough to ask questions. Fort Campbell's records show several training accidents that same year, each vague, each buried under bureaucratic language. I've learned that in the military, truth isn't erased. It's filed under classified and left to rot until no one cares anymore. When people ask me about my strangest night in uniform, I don't talk about firefights or foreign deployments. I tell them about that field, the cold steam, the smell of metal, the hum in the radio, and the black uniforms moving like shadows through the fog. I tell them about the colonel's voice, calm, absolute, final, because that night wasn't about war or politics. It was about control, about the kind of authority that doesn't answer to anyone and doesn't leave witnesses when things go wrong. I've made peace with a lot of things in my life. That night isn't one of them. It took me a long time to stop trying to rationalize what happened that night, to stop convincing myself there had to be some logical military explanation, a reason that fit into policy or procedure. But every time I went over it in my head, the pieces refused to fit. The deeper I thought about it, the more it became clear that what we saw wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act buried under layers of silence. Even the base itself seemed to pretend it never happened. No reports, no inquiries, no late-night briefings, not even a rumor in the barracks. It was as if the entire field had been swallowed by the dark, erased from Fort Campbell's map overnight. I've seen enough cover-ups to know what they look like, but this one had a precision that unnerved me. There were no rough edges, no whispers that slipped through the cracks, just a clean void where a helicopter and two men had once been. The thing about memory is it doesn't care about official versions of truth. It lingers like the smell of burnt oil, faint but permanent. Every few months I dream of that field, the crushed metal, the pale mist, and those black uniforms moving silently through the night. In the dreams, the colonel's order never fades. I still hear it, clear and quiet, like it's being whispered right behind me. Sometimes I wake up reaching for my sidearm that isn't there anymore. My wife used to ask what the dream was about, but after the first few times, I stopped answering. There are some things that don't belong outside the head. Some truths get smaller when you try to explain them. After I left active duty, I spent years trying to live like a normal man. Civilian life felt hollow at first. The silence too light, too ordinary. I took a job with a communications contractor for a while, the kind that still worked with base infrastructure. Maybe it was habit, or maybe I was just trying to stay close to the kind of noise I understood. Every time I passed by a control tower or a hangar, my mind flickered back to that night, the strange interference that had cut through every frequency we used. I ran through every possibility, technical and otherwise. Electromagnetic pulse, prototype jamming system. The frequencies we used that night were secure, scrambled, not something anyone could easily block. Whoever did it had access to technology I'd never seen before, and authorization to use it against US personnel. I used to think that was the most disturbing part, that someone on our own side had flipped the switch. But years later, I began to suspect something worse. that maybe it wasn't only human interference. The hum we heard that night, that low, droning vibration that made the air itself feel thick, didn't behave like any standard signal. It wasn't random static or mechanical feedback. It pulsed, almost like it was alive. When I tell people that, I know how it sounds. Paranoid, unhinged. But I can still feel it in my skull if I sit too long in silence. The same low resonance crawling back into the edges of thought. Still, I never said a word. I'd learned long ago that speaking too much about certain things makes people look at you differently. Even among veterans, there are stories you keep locked away. I carried mine like an unmarked file, tucked deep where no one could find it. Every now and then, though, a stray report or a declassified memo would cross my path. Something small, a phrase or a name that seemed out of place. Foreign Joint Operations Training, unacknowledged aerial mishap, advisory personnel casualties. Each time it felt like a ghost reaching through the paper, but no report ever mentioned Fort Campbell, February 1988, or anything that resembled the wreck we saw. It was almost too clean, as if someone had gone through history itself with a black marker. One night in 1995, years after I'd left uniform behind, I drove back through Kentucky, just passing near the base. I didn't plan to stop. It was late, and I told myself it was just curiosity. But as I neared the southern fence line, the same part of the base we'd patrolled that night, I slowed the truck and let the engine idle. The terrain looked different. New fencing, different roads, no trace of the open fields we'd driven through. But the air felt the same, heavy, watchful. The moment I turned off the headlights, I felt it, the faint pressure in the air, like the static before a storm. I sat there for nearly 10 minutes, engine off, windows cracked, waiting. There was nothing to see, no lights or movement. But then, just faintly, the radio crackled. I hadn't touched it. The truck's dial glowed dimly in the dark. For 3 seconds, that same electric hum filled the cab. Then silence. I turned the key and left without looking back. There's a saying among soldiers: the Army buries what it can't explain. I used to think it meant politics, paperwork, or the usual bureaucratic mess. But now I think it's something deeper. There are things the uniform world stumbles onto that were never meant to be touched. And once it does, all it can do is seal the door and pretend it never opened. Maybe that's what Fort Campbell was that night. A door that should have stayed closed, and we were the unlucky ones who saw inside before they slammed it shut. I've told myself countless versions of what might have been hiding behind that curtain: a covert operation, a botched transfer, a weapon test gone wrong. Each theory feels more hollow than the last. Sometimes when the past presses too close, I tell myself that maybe the hum was just interference after all, that maybe those black uniforms belonged to a classified cleanup unit doing what they had to. It's easier that way. But then I remember the colonel's eyes, the cold certainty when he gave that order, and I know better. Men don't kill their own for protocol, they kill for secrecy. What happened on that field wasn't just about a crash, it was about a message. The kind of message you don't put in writing. Leave when told, don't ask, don't return, forget. And for a long time I did try to forget, but forgetting isn't erasure, it's suppression, and suppression leaks. Every year that night seeps a little further into the cracks of memory, rewriting the quiet parts of my life. Sometimes I think about how easily we could have been erased, buried alongside that wreckage and written off as training casualties. A neat ending, one no one would have questioned. And sometimes late at night, I wonder if somewhere under that redeveloped stretch of land, the twisted remains of that Apache still sit beneath the soil, sealed under concrete and time, humming faintly to itself. By the time I finally began to settle into civilian life, the memory of that February night had faded just enough for me to function, but never far enough to rest. It lived somewhere below the surface, quiet but persistent, waiting for moments of stillness to remind me it was still there. I got married, moved into a small house outside Clarksville, and for a while I convinced myself that normalcy was possible. The Army was behind me, the uniform was packed away, the nights were quieter. My wife, patient and kind, thought my long silences were just the usual adjustment, another soldier learning to live without the constant rhythm of command. I let her believe that. It was easier than explaining that sometimes when I closed my eyes, I still saw the dim outline of that wreck burning through the fog, or heard the colonel's voice echoing over the hum of dead radios. We had kids a few years later, 2 of them. They changed everything. Parenthood anchors you in ways the military never can. The chaos becomes smaller when you've got someone small depending on you. But that's also when the questions came back, the ones I'd buried under work and routine. Late at night, after they were asleep, I'd sit in the dark living room, listening to the low buzz of the refrigerator and wondering what happened to those 2 men in the Apache. Where were they buried? Did anyone ever tell their families? Or did they vanish from the record entirely, like the rest of that night? I used to imagine their names typed in some forgotten report locked in a cabinet under fluorescent light, their existence reduced to a redacted line in a folder marked classified. The thought of that, the idea that 2 people could be erased so cleanly, haunted me more than the crash itself. I suppose that's when I started keeping my own records. Nothing dramatic, just a notebook I'd jot things into whenever the memories surfaced. Places, dates, radio frequencies, the make of the vehicles that arrived that night. It was a habit from my comms days, logging data even if no one would ever read it. Maybe part of me hoped that one day someone else would find it and finally piece together what we saw. But the longer I lived, the more I realized how unlikely that was. The military has a way of folding its secrets into history until they look like footnotes no one bothers to question. Sometimes when the world gets quiet enough, I think about the hum, that deep electric vibration that drowned out everything else. The kind that doesn't just fill your ears, but your bones. I've tried to explain it to myself 100 ways. Electromagnetic interference, a scrambling signal, a feedback loop. But none of that feels right. It wasn't random, and it wasn't mechanical. It felt intentional, almost intelligent, as if it was responding to us. I never told anyone that part. I could already picture the look I'd get, the polite nod people give when they're deciding whether to believe you or not. So I stayed silent. Silence is safer. It doesn't invite disbelief, and it doesn't risk waking whatever's buried beneath it. Still, I can't drive by Fort Campbell without feeling it. Even years later, when my work takes me down that same stretch of highway, I catch myself scanning the horizon for lights that shouldn't be there. The base has changed, new structures, new roads, but the southern perimeter still looks the same from a distance. Flat, quiet, watching. I tell myself it's superstition, but when I pass the turnoff near the old patrol routes, my radio sometimes cuts for a second. Just long enough to remind me that nothing that powerful ever really stops humming. My wife once found me standing in the yard after midnight, barefoot in the cold, just staring at the sky. She asked what I was looking for, and I told her I didn't know. That was true in a way. I wasn't looking for something. I was listening. Listening for that faint tone I still hear in the back of my mind, the one that makes every silence feel like a warning. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's memory echoing through nerves that never stop being on alert. But sometimes I wonder if that sound ever really left Fort Campbell, or if it's still there, humming under the soil where that wreck was buried, waiting for someone else to stumble across it. Some nights when sleep won't come, I think about what the colonel said. Dispose of their bodies along with that. The way he said it, so casual, so final. I've heard men give kill orders before, but never like that. Not without hesitation, not against their own. I can't explain it, but I know he meant it. That's the part that keeps me awake. Because if men like him are out there, men who can erase lives with a sentence and walk away clean, then maybe the worst monsters aren't buried in foreign jungles or hidden in deserts. Maybe they're stationed right here, just wearing darker uniforms. I don't talk about any of this anymore. Not to my wife, not to anyone. But I think about it every time the sky grows still before dawn. I think about how close we came to vanishing that night, how thin the line really was between silence and survival. Some days I almost convince myself it's over, that whatever secret we stumbled onto has long since faded into another generation's operation. But deep down, I know it never ended. Some things don't end. They wait. The older I got, the more I realized that time doesn't erase certain moments. It only teaches you to live around them. The world moved on. The base expanded. New wars came and went. New faces filled the ranks. But the memory of that night never faded. It just changed shape. Sometimes it came as a sound, faint and electric, like a low tone buried beneath the hum of power lines. Other times it was just a feeling, that same heavy stillness pressing against my ribs, the one that told me we had seen something we weren't meant to. You can convince yourself for years that something was just routine, just bad luck, just classified. But deep down, you always know when you've touched something unnatural. And what we found on that field, whatever that hum was, whatever force silenced every channel and froze the night in place, it wasn't just human protocol. It was something else, something older or colder than orders. After retirement, I tried to ignore the pull, but it found its way back every time I read about training accidents or aircraft losses that didn't make sense. One night, out of restlessness more than curiosity, I started looking up declassified documents, old crash reports, pilot lists, operational logs from the late 1980s. It didn't take long to notice how many files had been scrubbed, redacted, or renamed. Even entries that had no reason to be secret were missing entire pages. It was like someone had surgically cut out every mention of a particular event, anything tied to that month, that base, that part of Kentucky. What remained were fragments, stray details that felt familiar in the worst way. A foreign training exercise, an equipment malfunction, a radio blackout due to experimental interference. Each piece felt like a faint echo of that night, as if the government itself was writing in riddles to keep ghosts quiet. Sometimes I wonder if that's what the hum really was, not just a jamming frequency, but something designed to rewrite evidence as it happened. A signal strong enough to corrupt data, to block communication, maybe even to scramble memory. I've read about low-frequency transmissions used in psychological warfare, sound waves that can induce confusion, nausea, fear. The military tested them in the Cold War, classified them as non-lethal deterrents. But the hum we heard wasn't deterrent, it was erasure. It made the world smaller, sound slower, thought thinner. When I think back to it, there are gaps in my memory, seconds missing between when I saw the Honduran flag and when the headlights arrived. Maybe that's age, or maybe that's what they wanted. Black and I never talked about it again after that shift. It wasn't a formal pact. It just didn't need to be said. The silence between us was mutual and absolute. When I ran into him years later at a reunion, he looked older, quieter. We shook hands, made small talk about family and work, but his eyes told me he hadn't forgotten either. When he left, I noticed a small tremor in his hand as he reached for his coffee, like the hum still lived there too, under his skin. I tried to visit Fort Campbell once more in the early 2000s, long after I'd left the service for good. I didn't plan it. I was just driving through Tennessee, and before I realized it, the road signs started to look familiar. I pulled off near the old southern perimeter and parked by the fence line. It was unrecognizable now. New barriers, cleared land, a few unmarked facilities in the distance that didn't appear on any map I'd ever seen. The whole area was quiet, too quiet. Even the insects were silent. Then just for a moment, the radio in my truck flickered alive again, static swelling like breath. The same tone, the same hum. 3 seconds, maybe 4, then gone. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with recognition. It felt like being watched through a frequency I couldn't hear anymore. There are nights I sit on the porch, listening to nothing, and swear I can still feel it. The low vibration rolling through the ground like a distant engine under the soil. My wife says it's tinnitus, that it's in my head. Maybe she's right. Or maybe it's something that never stopped transmitting. I used to think the military was just hiding a mistake that night. A secret operation gone wrong, a crash they couldn't explain. But over the years, I've come to believe it wasn't about the crash at all. It was about containment. Whatever was in that helicopter, whatever kind of signal it was carrying or caught in, it wasn't supposed to exist outside a very small circle of people. And when it did, they came to bury it. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed those extra 30 seconds. Would we have been shot like the colonel promised? Or would we have simply vanished, Our names scrubbed from the duty roster, our truck reassigned, our families told we'd been transferred. Maybe that's what happened to others before us. Maybe that's why there were no records. The Army doesn't need to lie when it can just replace the truth with paperwork. I've spent decades trying to convince myself that night was an anomaly, one strange page in a long career. But the older I get, the more I think it was a glimpse through a hole we weren't supposed to see. Every government has its shadows, and sometimes those shadows hum. In the years that followed, life moved on in the way it always does. Slowly, stubbornly, without asking if you're ready to follow. The Army faded into memory, the uniforms packed away, the routine replaced by quieter responsibilities. But the ghosts of service never really retire. They just learn to wear different faces. For me, that ghost took the shape of a sound, the low, steady hum that once filled my radio, now echoing in the quiet moments of my days. I heard it again the year my old friend Jimmy died. He was a pilot by then, an Apache pilot, stationed at Fort Campbell, of all places. His bird went down during a training run in 2018. Mechanical failure, they said. No foul play. The same words I'd heard 100 times before. When I got the call, it felt like a circle had closed, one that had been waiting 30 years to finish drawing itself. Jimmy had been the kind of man who never showed anger. No matter how bad things got, he laughed through stress, joked through exhaustion, and kept morale high even when everything else was falling apart. We'd served together during a deployment to the Philippines years earlier, back when we were younger, and believed we'd already seen everything the world had to throw at us. That trip was supposed to be simple. Joint training exercises with local Marines, live fire drills, building trust between nations. It was all supposed to be routine, but nothing about our lives ever really stayed that way. We'd been attached to Anglico, the Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company, training with the Philippine Marines in the spring of 2015. Jimmy was the one who made it happen, all charm and confidence, getting our recon team folded into the exercises so we could observe and coordinate. For a week, it was every soldier's version of heaven, overlooking a valley filled with old vehicles and mock targets, calling in artillery, watching Apaches scream overhead as they tore those targets apart. The sky would light up with tracer rounds and missile trails, and Jimmy would stand there like a kid at a fireworks show, shouting over the explosions. "One day that's gonna be me up there." I believed him. I think we all did. The irony still sits like a stone in my chest. When the exercise ended, we were supposed to be picked up and ferried back to base by convoy. Simple task. But in the military, simple rarely survives contact with reality. The Humvee that came for us that night was late, rain pouring hard enough to drown headlights. When it finally showed, it was overloaded with gear, rucksacks strapped along the sides, a tarp pulled over everything. We didn't think much of it. We just wanted out of the mud and back to dry ground. Jimmy climbed in first, laughing about how the Marines couldn't drive worth a damn, and I followed him. Within minutes of moving, we started to notice the smell. Diesel and exhaust, sharp and heavy. I'd smelled it 1,000 times before, but this was different, thicker, wrong. At first, we all tried to ignore it, covering our mouths with cloth, shouting half jokes about the sweet perfume of government-issued fuel. But within 10 minutes, people were coughing, gagging. My throat burned. I yelled to the driver to slow down, to crack a window, but he couldn't hear over the rain. That smell filled the tarp like a poison fog. I looked over at Jimmy, sitting near the back, his face half lit by flashes of lightning, and shouted for him to check the exhaust pipe, see if it was damaged or blocked. He twisted around, but the rucksacks were piled too high. Nobody could see a damn thing. The air was getting worse, heavy enough that it felt hard to think. That's when I decided to act. I slapped the cab and yelled, "Stop the truck!" Now! We spilled out into the rain, gasping, half laughing from relief, half choking from fumes. The cold air hit like a wave of medicine. I circled to the back of the truck to see what was wrong, and what I found made my blood run cold. Whoever had loaded that vehicle had pulled the tarp up and over the exhaust pipe, sealing it tight like a lid. Every bit of exhaust had been trapped under it, funneled straight into the covered cargo area. Into us. It wasn't just carelessness, it was lethal stupidity. I smacked Jimmy on the shoulder and dragged him over to look. "You trying to get us killed?" I shouted, though the anger wasn't for him. We ripped the tarp back, rain soaking the gear beneath it. None of us said much after that. We just climbed out, breathing hard, knowing how close we'd come to dying from something as dumb as a misplaced tarp. Looking back, I think about that night more than I should. About how Jimmy laughed it off afterward, how he told the story like it was a joke, a funny near miss. But now, after what happened at Fort Campbell, it doesn't feel funny at all. It feels connected, like threads from the same fabric, weaving tragedy through coincidence. Maybe it's paranoia, or maybe it's the truth. But when his Apache went down decades later on the same base where we'd once found that wreck, I couldn't see it as random. I didn't go to the crash site, didn't ask questions, didn't want to hear the official story. I already knew how those stories end. Sometimes I imagine him up there, calling in strikes over the valley again, his voice crackling through the static like it used to. Other times I think about that tarp, that sealed truck, that near-death moment under foreign skies, and wonder if that was the first warning. The universe's way of saying that some men are marked early. Jimmy used to say we were born too late for the great wars and too early for peace. Maybe he was right. Maybe all of us who came up in that strange in-between, post-Vietnam, pre-modern, were ghosts in waiting. Now when I hear the faint hum on the radio late at night, I don't reach to turn it off anymore. I just listen. Maybe it's feedback. Maybe it's memory. Or maybe it's Jimmy, still out there, flying low through the dark, his rotors slicing through mist above a field that was never supposed to exist. Hey, some stories never really end. They just go quiet, waiting for the next voice willing to speak them aloud. What happened that night at Fort Campbell wasn't written in any report or etched into any memorial, but it lives in the static between memories, alive in every hum of silence that follows a soldier home. If this story pulled you in, there are more like it. Buried encounters, lost patrols, and classified echoes from forgotten wars. Subscribe to Captain Rebel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next declassified nightmare from the shadows of military history.